Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Can You Train Your Brain to Cope with Pain webinar. We're glad to have you here with us today. My name is Tanya Hyde and I'll be moderating the webinar today. I'm the project manager with the Canadian Institute for the Relief of Pain and Disability, and this webinar is made possible through the support of the Community Gaming Grant program through the BC government, as well as donations and memberships to our organization. As I mentioned, my name is Tanya, and I'll be moderating the webinar and the Q&A session today. And our presenter is Dr. Tim Salomons. Dr. Salomons is an Associate Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience at the University of Reading in the UK. A clinical psychologist by training, he is primarily doing research into how cognition and emotion alter the brain's response to pain. His aim is to better understand these mechanisms so we can assist people in coping with chronic pain. Thank you very much for being with us today, Tim. I will hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Tanya, and welcome everybody to the webinar. I usually start my talks just with a very simple question. It looks deceptively simple, but proves difficult for people. And that's simply, what is pain? Okay, so pain is something we could describe this way. I shall not today attempt further to define it, but I know it when I see it. So we all have felt pain, and we know what it feels like when we feel it, but to try to describe it is quite a bit trickier. Now, this definition was actually from a U.S. Justice Potter Stewart's description of pornography, but I think it fits equally well for pain. So we know it when we see it. What does pain look like? I'm just going to show you a little bit, somebody going through a pain stimulus in our lab.
Wow. There it is again. Ow, owie, ow.
So what I really like to bring out in that video is, first of all, you know, he's having a very emotional experience of the pain. He's not just simply saying, oh, you put a hot thermote on my arm and it feels terrible. You can see him viscerally responding and having quite an animated response. It's clear that it's very unpleasant for him. Now, the next question we might ask is, what is pain good for? I think that's a question, especially if you suffer with chronic pain, that you find yourself asking a lot. It's helpful sometimes to go back and just remind ourselves what this experience is for in the first place. And I'm going to explain it using the example of, this is an individual who is born without the ability to feel pain. Okay, so he's unable to experience pain, and he's going to describe here a situation that he encountered.
The last time I broke my foot, it was actually out in the woods and it was nighttime, so it's pretty much like walking around with your eyes closed. Mm-hmm. And when I broke my foot, I didn't instantly know that I did it because I was stepping over a stump, and when I stepped over, there was another log on the opposite side of it that my foot had gotten wedged into. And I fell over and cracked it. And I didn't know that happened until after I tried to get back up. And when I got back up, I went to go put my foot down, and I could hear the cracking of bone. But then also I had like this, like a rush feeling, like a kind of just like blood, like it felt like blood was going through my leg, kind of, is what it felt like, but I wasn't actually bleeding.
Okay, so I apologize for, you know, some of the rather gruesome images, but I think this really brings home very well why pain is a necessary thing. You know, what for those of you who didn't hear that clearly, what he's essentially saying is, you know, he breaks his ankle and he doesn't even know that it's happened, except that he hears it, and he has some sort of sensory phenomena in his leg. Okay, and the thing about people like this who are born without the ability to feel pain is that they often experience quite gruesome injuries. This individual told us that he had actually never been in a swimming pool before the age of 16 because he was almost permanently in a cast. This, gives you some idea of what it must be like for these people. It really, many of them die early because they aren't able to avoid injuries. And what he's essentially saying is, I have to learn cues associated with dangerous things. I have to recognize from sounds and from feelings in my body and sights, when I'm actually in danger of injuring myself. So pain really serves a protective function. It allows us to immediately withdraw from things that could potentially harm us. So here's the definition of pain as given by the International Association for the Study of Pain. It's an unpleasant sensory and emotional experience associated with actual or potential tissue damage or described in terms of such damage. And there's a couple of things there that I really like to highlight. One being that in addition to being a sensory phenomena, it's an emotional experience, okay? And we saw that in that first video clip, that he wasn't just experiencing the hot thermode as a sensory phenomenon, but also quite clearly as an emotional one. The other is that it is associated with actual or potential tissue damage or described in terms of such damage. And what this makes clear is that there is not always a one-to-one link to injury. We don't have to see an injury, or we don't have to detect some problem in the body at the site in order to judge something as pain. So all that matters is that it's described in terms of injury or in terms of a feeling from the body. Okay, and this is a very important point. Many people who go to have their pain assessed can be given the feeling that their pain isn't legitimate if there is not some peripheral source that can be found. And this definition really leaves it open that if something is felt as if it's an injury, it constitutes pain. So pain has an important emotional component, and the question is whether we can control the emotional response to pain. So if it is an emotional experience, can we control that emotional experience? And I'm going to give you an example of somebody who is doing just that. Here's the same individual we showed a minute ago, and he's going to describe. So what's an example of something that might be painful that doesn't bother you?
I could poke my finger and get a spot of blood and do a blood test on diabetic.
Mm-hmm. And that doesn't bother you?
Painful. You have to do it.
Okay. So because you have to do it, it doesn't bother you as much?
Shot. Absolutely shot.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so just in case that wasn't clear, what he's saying is, he's diabetic, he's got to poke himself to take a blood sample, but he knows he's got to do it, and he knows it's in his best interest, it's for his benefit, and so it doesn't bother him the same way. He's essentially controlling his emotional response because of what he knows about the stimulus. And that's a perfect example of the type of thing that I'm going to be focusing on and that I'm interested in, is that if we change the emotional response to pain, does the overall experience change? So I'm going to be talking about some of my research in this field, and I'll tell you about the goals of this research. First of all, I'm looking to understand how cognitive and emotional states alter the response to nociceptive input. And nociceptive input is just input that's intense enough to cause pain. Okay? So we want to know how that happens. And the second one is to understand who is able to use these mechanisms to cope successfully. I'm often, as Tanya mentioned, I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and when I was working with pain patients, it's often quite striking that some patients, will have pain, and it doesn't really get in the way of their functioning. They're able to go on with their lives as usual. And you meet other individuals who may have a similar condition, but get stuck in sort of a negative cycle of depression and pain, and the two, depression enhances pain and pain enhances depression and so on. And one of the focuses of my work and that of many others is to understand, okay, why is it that these people differ like this? And is there some way that we can help people who are stuck in this negative cycle to become more like the people who are going on despite the pain and who seem to be able to function again? So there's one primary variable that I've been using to study this, and that's perceived control. Now, perceived control is the belief that one has at one's disposal a response that can influence the aversiveness of an event. And this picture of a fish kind of illustrates that nicely. This fish is basically watching the water leak out of his bag, and there's nothing, you know, it's lacking perceived control. There's nothing it can do to do anything about the situation. Now, one of the reasons I'm interested in this is that there's quite a good literature going back and studying something called learned helplessness. And essentially what that is they would have two groups of animals, and one group would receive a set of shocks, but there was a response that they could make, say pressing a button or a lever, and if they pressed the button or lever, the shock would stop. And then what the researchers did was they would give the identical set of shocks to another set of animals, the only difference being that the other set of animals they had no response available to them to control that heat response or that shock. And what they found is even though the two groups received exactly the same set of shocks, the group that had no control over the shocks showed reduced motivation. Okay, they stopped moving, stopped getting up to do things. Their learning was impaired. So even after that, if you gave them a response that could stop the shocks, they wouldn't learn that because they had already become convinced that nothing they could do would change their situation. And they also had an increase in negative emotion. And one of the reasons I'm interested in this is that I feel like this is a situation that many people with chronic pain find themselves in, is that they've gone to many doctors, they've tried different pills, they've tried different behavioral solutions, and nothing seems to be taking away the pain. And it's easy to see how in a situation like that somebody could experience reduced motivation, that they could come to believe that new treatments weren't going to work, and that they could have increased negative emotions like depression or anxiety. And this is what we find in the research as well, is that when we study people with chronic pain, those who report low levels of perceived control over pain report more depression, more pain severity, and increased functional disability. Okay, so I think that this is a variable that really is worth studying and will help us understand the condition of people who are in chronic pain. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I study this. This is a study that we published a little over 10 years ago now in the Journal of Neuroscience. And we were interested in one question: how does perceived control alter pain processing? And who is able to cope with uncontrollable pain? Okay? And so we answered that by comparing controllable and uncontrollable pain in 17 healthy individuals, and we used functional MRI for this. Okay? And here's what that looks like. So subjects saw a cue, and they were told that if they saw a pink cue, if they pressed the joystick in the direction of the arrow, that they'd get only a short 2-second heat burst rather than a long 5-second heat burst. If they saw a white cue, they were told that we still want you to move the arrow in the direction or move the joystick in the direction of the arrow, but your response isn't going to make any difference in terms of how long the heat is. Now, in reality, they received exactly the same ratio of short and long stimuli in both conditions. So just as in those learned helplessness studies, there's no difference between the conditions in how much heat they receive or how much pain they go through. The only difference is what they believe about the stimulus. So in the pink condition, they believe that they have no control. In the white condition, they believe that they have control over the heat pain. And what we found was quite striking. All the regions you see in green or blue were significantly more active when individuals had no control over their pain. Okay, so it's quite striking the the level of response that they had. We separate this into two different kinds of activation. The blue regions outlined in blue only responded when the pain was uncontrollable. They didn't have a significant response to the controllable pain. And what that suggests to us is that these are regions that only are involved in evaluating the context in which the pain occurs. You know, did I have control? What do I need to do? Et cetera, et cetera. They're not involved in processing the pain per se. And those are regions like the ventral medial prefrontal cortex here and the ventral lateral prefrontal cortex, which isn't shown on these pictures, but I'll show you in a bit. Okay, and these are regions I'm going to keep coming back to because they seem to be regions that are involved in evaluating the context in which pain occurs. What's the level of danger? How much control do I have? What other information do I need to know to respond properly to this pain? Now, the regions in green were also more active when pain was uncontrollable, but participants still had a significant response to the controllable pain. So what this is basically saying is no matter what kind of pain you deliver, these regions are active, but when the pain is uncontrollable, they're more active. And the way we are thinking about this is that those are regions that are involved in processing or integrating the sensation, the heat pain, as well as the cognitive context. Okay, and these are regions like the insula, which you see here, and the anterior cingulate cortex up here. Okay, and these are regions that you see very often in pain studies. You see them so often that they've come to be known as the pain matrix. Okay, so these are regions that are activated in almost every neuroimaging study of pain. Here we see the anterior cingulate, the insula. We also see here regions associated with sensory processing. This is S1, the primary somatosensory cortex, and motor processing. This is primary motor cortex, M1. Okay, and this is basically the same thing. This is a meta-analysis of 311 imaging studies of pain, and again, you find this anterior cingulate region, and here's the insula that I was just talking about, as well as thalamus and several other regions. Okay, so essentially the message is if you do a neuroimaging study of pain and these regions don't activate, you're probably doing something wrong. It's very, this is basically what we see every time. So I mentioned that I was also interested in who copes best. Okay, so what we did was we followed up that initial study with a further study where we examined individual differences. And what we were interested in here was when pain is uncontrollable, who is having the greatest increase in their pain ratings, okay? And what we found was this. We found two different prefrontal cortex responses. Here we have the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, which I was mentioning to you a little earlier. And this is during the anticipation period when they're looking at the cue. And what we found is the higher this response was in anticipation of pain, the lower their pain ratings in uncontrollable pain, okay? Now, here's the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, and this is during pain, and this is a completely different type of response. When the more activation you have here during pain, the higher they rate the uncontrollable pain. And what we found is that if you know what these two regions are doing, you know a great deal about how people's pain is going to be affected, okay? About 65% of the variance in pain ratings was just due to these regions, okay? So what this tells us is that these prefrontal regions are quite important in determining how you're going to respond when the context of your pain changes. Now, we were particularly interested in this response in the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex because this negative association, it suggests that there's kind of a warning going on, that people who are doing well anticipate that an uncontrollable stimulus is coming and they kind of try to cope with it. And what we found was that we did a correlation between that activation and some coping strategies that they commonly used. And what we found is that the people who seemed to do well in this context and had big ventrolateral prefrontal activation endorsed emotion-focused coping strategies. And the way I might describe that is, if you would imagine two people sitting in traffic. Okay, they're both stuck in traffic. One of them can't deal with the fact that he's in traffic, and so he's honking on his horn. He's trying to drive on the side of the road. He's trying to change lanes frequently. Essentially, he wants a behavioral solution. Okay, he wants to get himself out of traffic. In most cases, if the traffic is bad, that person's just going to get progressively more frustrated and more frustrated. Whereas the person in the second car may take an emotion-focused coping strategy. They may turn up the radio. They may just try to accept that the pain is, or that the traffic isn't going anywhere. And subsequently, they will, be much better off emotionally than the other individual. And that's what we found here. So here we see that high ventrolateral prefrontal responses are associated with low levels of denial. Now, we also have the inverse relationship in another plot, which is that high levels of acceptance are associated with high levels of ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. So it seems like the people who are using this ventrolateral prefrontal response in anticipation of uncontrollable pain are more like our person in the second car. They're the ones who are just trying to deal with the emotional response to uncontrollable pain. So again, that emotional response is really, to me, one of the important things. That's what we're really, when we use strategies like, say, cognitive behavioral therapy or other psychotherapeutic interventions, mindfulness or whatever, that's what we're quite often targeting, is that emotional response to pain and trying to teach people some strategies for emotion-focused coping. So just to review, how does perceived control alter pain processing, and who is able to cope with uncontrollable pain? We found that emotion regulation regions like the ventrolateral and ventral medial prefrontal cortex underlie individual differences in coping. Another finding in this study was that pain matrix regions like the anterior cingulate and the insula are sensitive to the cognitive context. Okay, so the pain matrix doesn't only respond to pain, it also responds to the context in which pain occurs. Now, I mentioned that I was really interested in the emotional response to pain, and in particular uncontrollable pain. Now, there was one problem with the previous study that I showed you, and that was that all subjects got both controllable and uncontrollable pain. And the net effect of that is that they walk away saying, well, you win some, you lose some. I did okay at controlling some of them, and others I wasn't able to. What we're more interested in is a situation like somebody with chronic pain who has a low level of perceived control might experience, is that they're constantly getting pain that they don't feel like they can control. And so what we were interested in doing was studying what happens, what's the emotional state that occurs when somebody gets prolonged uncontrollable pain. So in other words, we want to understand who experiences the greatest reduction of negative emotion when they perceive control, okay? And for this, we used fMRI to compare neural and emotional responses in 52 healthy subjects who were exposed to either prolonged controllable or uncontrollable pain. And I'll show you how that works. So we randomized all our subjects into one of two groups. In the controllable group, subjects were shown a cue that indicated they had to make a certain pattern of button presses. Now, we told them if you make the right pattern of button presses, you're just going to receive a short rather than long stimulus. So, if you were supposed to receive a 10-second stimulus, you'll get a 5-second stimulus. If you're supposed to get a 5-second stimulus, you'll get a 2-second stimulus. So they failed for a few trials. You see these first 5 red trials where they're failing. And then once they figure out the correct response, if they repeat that on all the other trials, they get feedback that says, you successfully controlled the pain, okay? So again, if they receive a 5-second stimulus, they feel like it would have been a 10-second stimulus, but because they made the right response, they only got a 5. Now, the unfortunate people who got sorted into the uncontrollable group, there was no response that they could make they kept on trying and trying and trying, and they failed every time, okay? Now, secretly, there was no response they could make that would have helped them. And so this allows us to study this in a very interesting way, because these subjects will receive exactly the same 5-second stimulus that these guys received. The only difference is they believe that when they receive a 5-second stimulus, that they failed to reduce it to a 2-second stimulus. So what we did is we studied 20 unmatched or 20 5-second long stimuli, okay, between the groups. The difference being, you know, exactly the same stimuli. The difference being this group, the controllable group, believed that they had reduced the pain. The uncontrollable group believed that they had failed to reduce the pain. So the only difference between the two conditions is what the individuals believe about their stimuli. Okay, and as we would predict, the individuals in the controllable condition had reductions in anxiety. So we took an anxiety measure before and after the study, and the controllable group had reductions in anxiety. The uncontrollable group had a significant increase in anxiety. So as we would expect, uncontrollable pain causes an anxiety response. And I think that you know, that is true of many people we see in the clinic. It's also true when we do studies like this in other labs. And so we were interested in these individual differences. And so what we studied were two regions in particular. This is the amygdala you see here on the top right in blue. This is a region that's often associated with negative emotions like fear and anxiety. Okay. And we also studied the nucleus accumbens down here at the bottom right in blue. And this is a region that's often associated with reward. And the reason we studied these two regions was that many theorists have suggested that the effects of gaining control over stimuli are twofold. First of all, you have, when you gain control, you have reduced responses, reduced fear responses, and we would expect reduced responses in the amygdala, and you have increased, it's rewarding to gain control. And so we took these two regions and we asked a simple question. We asked, where in the brain is connectivity of these regions associated with reduced anxiety? Okay, so what we're basically asking, what we're trying to find out is, if this is a fear region and this is a reward region, what other regions are connected with it in order to bring down anxiety levels when people have control, okay? And what we found was a very similar region to the one I showed you in the first study, the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. So it seems like this ventrolateral prefrontal cortex is taking an assessment of whether you have control and then sending signals to these regions down deeper in the brain that are associated with emotional responses, and they're regulating the anxiety response. Okay, so once again we have this same ventrolateral prefrontal region regulating the response to uncontrollable and controllable pain. And we found a similar response in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, which was the other region I associated with cognitive control over pain. Okay, so connectivity of this region with the amygdala and nucleus accumbens was also associated with reduced anxiety. Okay, so to go back to our original question, who experiences the greatest reduction of negative emotion when they perceive control? And as in the first study, we found that individuals who are able to recruit ventrolateral and ventral medial prefrontal cortex to regulate affective sensors in the striatum and amygdala seem to do better when they gain control. Okay, so once again, these same prefrontal regions are mediating the emotional and response to pain when it is controllable. So I'm just going to review some of the conclusions from these first couple studies. First of all, in terms of how this works, we found that cognitive control over pain reduces activation in what we've come to call the pain matrix, regions like the anterior cingulate and the insula. We found that ventral medial and ventrolateral prefrontal cortex are involved in evaluating the cognitive context in which pain occurs. And they seem to control, these prefrontal regions seem to control emotional responses through connectivity with primary affect regions or emotional regions, such as the amygdala and the nucleus accumbens. And in terms of who, we found that individuals who are able to enact ventral medial and ventrolateral prefrontal cortical mediated regulation strategies seem to cope better when behavioral control is unavailable. Okay, so these regions really seem to be involved in helping people to cope with pain, particularly when it's uncontrollable. Okay, so when we're asking the question at the heart of my talk title, are we able to train our brain to cope with pain? These might be the regions that we're looking to. Can we alter responses in these regions in order to help people better cope with pain? Now, I'm going to put my conclusions in some perspective, partially to help you understand how we might best interpret findings from MRI studies. So I'm going to go back to the beginning of my talk. If you remember this individual, remember what we saw about him. He was the one who had quite an active response when we put the hot thermode on him. He had a very obvious emotional response. He said, "Owie, owie, you," and kind of jumped out of his seat a bit. He was also the individual who was able to tell us that he could regulate the emotional response to pain based on what he knew. He knew that tapping his finger to get a blood sample was good for him, and so he didn't allow that pain to bother him. Okay, so this is basically exactly what we are aiming at, and he's fully capable of all the things that we have been looking at. Now I'm going to show you a picture of his brain. Now, what you have here is our ventral medial prefrontal cortex, our anterior cingulate up here, the insula, and the amygdala. Now, these black regions are completely lesioned in his brain. So this is is pause for thought, because all of the regions that I just finished telling you were necessary for people to feel pain and necessary for them to regulate their emotional response to pain, this individual is missing. So he maintains the functions that we're talking about without the brain regions that I've been trying to convince you were important. So this really, this is the sort of finding that makes us really step back and ask, why is this happening? What does this mean for the studies that we're doing? So one of the things we have to do in terms of better understanding these brain responses are improve our inferences about the brain's role in cognitive modulation. So the first thing we need to do is understand whether particular brain regions, such as the pain matrix, are necessary or sufficient for pain. Okay? Do we need these regions? Are they, and when these regions are on, are they sufficient evidence that pain is occurring? So in order to do that, we kind of go back to our original question. What is pain? Is intense emotional experience painful? That's kind of the subject of a topic that's become kind of popular. It's called a study of something called social pain. Okay. Now, this is an experiment that came out in Science about a little over 10 years ago. And what the researchers did was they put a person in the scanner and they said, in another room, there's two other people who are going to be playing, they're playing catch, and you're going to be included in their game. So the person would put on a set of virtual reality goggles, and he'd see two other individuals throwing the ball back and forth to each other. And then at a certain point, the other two would start throwing the ball to the individual in the scanner, and he would merrily play along with them in their game. And then at a later point, they suddenly would start excluding the individual from the game, and they would just throw back and forth to each other. So the person felt like they had been rejected. And what they found was activation in this region of the anterior cingulate that we've seen to be associated with pain. And so the interpretation the researchers made was that rejection was painful, okay, and that it was experienced as painful. Well, this was quite a popular idea because the metaphor that social distress is painful is used often. We say, you know, that person broke my heart when they left me. You know, it really hurt when my friend said something mean to me. You know, that's something we've used often as a metaphor, but this almost suggests that that metaphor is rooted in the brain and that, you know, those responses are actually painful. So this really caught on. So, you know, here we begin to see evolutionary theories coming out of it. So here's one that came out in Psychological Bulletin. It said, social exclusion is experienced as painful because reactions to rejection are mediated by aspects of the physical pain system. Okay, so the reason that we feel social exclusion as painful is because they're processed in the same regions of the brain. And then it went even further than, you know, other things started becoming painful, such as math. You know, so when math hurts, people would do math and we would see activation in these same regions of the brain, and so then suddenly math is painful. And this really caught on also in the popular press. So we see here in Time magazine, in the brain, broken hearts hurt like broken bones. We also saw it come up in the New York Times. Rejection may hurt more than feelings, and the gist being socially rejected doesn't just feel bad, it hurts. Okay? Now, this is very interesting. I think it's very important that we study kind of when two phenomena have the same involvement of the same brain regions. I think it's really important because it forces us to ask, okay, how are these things separate and how are they, you know, how are they alike and how are they distinct from each other? But it's actually quite important that we be accurate about this, and I'll show you an example of why. Now, I used to work in a clinic in Toronto where they did electroconvulsive therapy for depression. Now, that's quite a good treatment, despite for treatment refractory depression. That's a pretty good treatment if done in very mild doses. It's not like back in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest where, you know, they would use huge doses and to devastating effect. It's used much more safely, but still the stigma of the treatment sticks around. And it was written up in the Toronto Star, which some of you may be familiar with. And this was one of the responses to this expose. If people are this desperate for treatment, why not just prescribe painkillers? Emotional pain has been closely linked to the part of the brain where physical pain exists, and it would probably be more effective and humane with less long-term side effects. Now, you could see, if we follow this logic along, you could see people being prescribed you know, opiates like OxyContin for depression. I don't know if any of you know people who are addicted to these kinds of pills, but, you know, this is a big problem, and I think it would become a far bigger problem if we were to start doing it for, you know, common maladies like depression. And so you see here where, you know, if we're not accurate about what this overlapping activation means, we can sort of take ourselves down the road to some potentially unhelpful conclusions. And so I want to talk to you about why I think we need to be cautious about those kinds of results. And I think this will also shed light on why, you know, this person without anterior cingulate and insula can still feel pain, and why some of our inferences might be wrong. I'm going to talk to you about something called reverse inference, which is a method that's often used to infer meaning from imaging studies. So what we try to do when we run an imaging study is often we try to identify the mental processes that are engaged when a subject performs a mental task. Okay, so if we have them in the task doing a memory, in the scanner doing a memory task, we see a certain region lit up, and we try to make inferences about what the mental processes are that are going on. Now, this is, you know, necessary to do, but it also has some drawbacks. When we infer a given state based on brain activation alone, for example, that the cingulate cortex is activated and therefore the person is in pain, we are relying on a logical error called affirming the consequent. And I'm going to explain to you what that means. Okay, so in propositional logic, we have something called the modus ponens, and that's a valid form of argument that takes the following form. I'll show you. When John does laundry, he uses more electricity. John is doing laundry. Therefore, he's using more electricity. So this is rock-solid logic that you can't really debate your way out of that. If condition 1 and condition 2 are true, then condition 3 has to be true. Okay? Now, where this gets a little tricky is we might imagine a superficially similar but actually fallacious form of argument that's known as affirming the consequent. And that takes the following form. Okay, so you'll note that this looks similar, but it really isn't similar. When John does laundry, he uses more electricity. John is using more electricity, therefore he's doing laundry. Okay? Now you can sort of see the problems that come up here. The problem is that there's many potential explanations for why John is using more electricity. He might be baking a cake. He might be using his electric razor. Thus, greater power usage is not sufficient evidence that he's doing laundry. Okay, there might be a lot of explanations for why he's using more electricity. So we can't infer that he's doing laundry. Now, I'm going to show you that this basic form of argument is the same one that we're using in when we do reverse inference on brain imaging. Okay, so if a person feels pain, the pain matrix is activated. The pain matrix is activated. Therefore, the person is experiencing pain. So you see that the logic there is the same as in the first example. The one that we showed isn't actually correct. Okay. Now, this conclusion is based on flawed logic, but there's still a possibility that it's correct. If the only thing that the pain matrix does is generate pain, then we might say that this inference is still correct. Okay, so if there's an exclusive relationship between the pain matrix and the experience of pain, then even though the logic is flawed, conclusion number 3 is still pretty strong. So in order to evaluate the likelihood of that conclusion being correct, we have to ask ourselves whether the pain matrix activation is specific to the state of pain, okay? Because that's the only condition under which this logic will hold. So the question is, how specific is the pain matrix activation to pain? And this is a study we did a few years back. We did a meta-analysis. We took 70 or 80 studies of negative emotion, 70 or 80 studies of pain, and an equal number of cognitive control studies, things like Stroop tasks or working memory. And what we found is that all of these different tasks lit up the anterior cingulate. And you'll see that this is the region that was used in this social exclusion study to infer pain. And you'll see that that's pretty much the same region here. So it would be equally valid for us to say when somebody was socially excluded, they had negative emotion, or that they were having a tough time with the sort of cognitive control of the situation. So what we would then say is that this is not specific so much for pain. It's used in a broader domain of functioning. And to illustrate this further, I'm going to go back to my individual with congenital analgesia. So this individual we heard from earlier who isn't able to feel pain. And what we did is we got him in the scanner, he and another individual with the same issue. And we used a stimulus, a mechanical stimulus that is experienced as painful by most people. And we scanned his brain. And what we found was that in red we see the pain matrix as outlined in my earlier slides with the anterior cingulate and the insula. And what we found was pretty much identical levels of activation in the individual who didn't feel pain within this pain matrix. Okay, so here we have the individuals who don't feel pain. Here we have the individuals who do feel pain. So again, the only difference between these two conditions is that one feels pain, one group feels pain and the other doesn't. And we see almost identical activation. So what this suggests to us is that just seeing pain matrix activation alone is not sufficient evidence that an individual is feeling pain. Okay, so again, this suggests that we need to make stronger inferences. And so in terms of improving those inferences, another thing we need are longitudinal studies where we do an intervention, because this allows us to see this to understand these things better. So what we want to do is make an intervention and see how the brain changes along over time. Okay, and this is also, I'm going to show you a study where we actually, so the title of my talk was Train Your Brain to Cope with Pain. And I'm going to show you a study that we've just published in 2014, where we actually did some brain training to try to alter how they respond to pain. So the question we're interested in here is how, whether altering how people think about pain changes how they respond to it. And what we studied was something called secondary hyperalgesia. So in the red square here, that's where our thermode, basically where we put the thermode, where they experience the pain. And then what we do afterwards is we get a pen and we tap along these blue lines, and we ask them to tell us when they first start to feel pain. So what you're studying here is sensitivity around the wound site, okay? And that's something that we call secondary hyperalgesia, and that is known to be mediated by the brain and spinal cord. We have a really strong role for brainstem regions that send signals down to the spinal cord and control how much pain someone is in. So if we see this secondary hyperalgesia around the wound, then we know that the person's brain is sort of controlling their pain responses. So what we did is we gave pain over 8 sessions that were held on separate days. In each of these sessions, they got 45 8-second long pain stimuli. And in the first and the last session, we measured their secondary hyperalgesia after the session, okay? And in all 8 of these sessions, we took pain ratings and we gave them a brief cognitive training, which I'll explain in a minute. So the subjects were randomized into 2 groups. In the control group, they just got a brief 5-minute cognitive training that helped them to cope better with, deal with interpersonal situations, talk to their friends, and so on. It had nothing to do with the pain. In the regulate group, we tried to train them to reduce their emotional response to pain. So we would talk to them about some of their nervousness and fear about the pain stimuli that were coming, and we tried to focus on some of the benefits of learning to better deal with it. So that basically what they were changing was their emotional and cognitive response to the pain. Now what we found was that both groups reported less pain intensity over time because they just kind of got used to the pain stimuli a little bit. What we found, though, was that the individuals in the regulate group had significantly more reduction in the unpleasantness of pain. So they were really telling us that the pain bothered them less than the other individuals. So that shows us that our manipulation was working, that when we train people to reduce the unpleasantness of pain, it really does work. Now, more interesting than this was that these same individuals in the regulate group had significant reduction in secondary hyperalgesia. So I think that's quite exciting, because what that means is that when we train them to reduce their cognitive and emotional response to pain, their brain is actually sending signals down to their body to inhibit the secondary hyperalgesia. So changing the thoughts and feelings associated with the pain is actually changing the sensitivity of the skin around the wound, and I find that quite exciting. You see here, each of these represents one individual. Most of these individuals are having reductions in secondary hyperalgesia. We see a couple who aren't. So, in subsequent studies, what we want to understand is who are the individuals who are benefiting most from this, and, how do we make these individuals who aren't benefiting from it perform better and, get more benefit from the treatment. And just the last note, we also found that this training changed responses in the medial prefrontal cortex and the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. And those are regions that earlier I told you were associated with successful coping. And so what we're seeing is that this brain training, or this training, also changes the neural responses associated with pain. We get altered responses during the pain, and we get more connectivity between these 2 regions when the individuals are at rest. Okay? So in response to the question, can altering how people think about pain change how they respond to it? The answer is that cognitive behavioral intervention alters not only pain unpleasantness, but secondary hyperalgesia, suggesting changes in descending control of pain signals. And secondly, cognitive behavioral intervention alters the neural processing in regions associated with cognitive control over pain. And with that, I'm going to open the floor to questions. Thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you very much, Tim. That was a very good presentation. We've got someone asking, with your subject who had the diabetic blood sample and also did the pain testing, the emotional pain testing, someone was asking if you did a brain scan with the heat versus when he pricked his finger for the diabetic blood sample, and if there was a difference.
Yeah, we absolutely did. Unfortunately, this is one of the great tragedies of my scientific career, is that when you saw in the original film when we gave him the burn stimulus and he jumped like that, unfortunately when we put him in the scanner and gave him the same stimulus, he also jumped. And because of that, the data becomes basically unusable, because the brain split into little 2 millimeter cluster or voxels. And when a person moves in the scanner, a voxel that's in one place is suddenly way in another place. So unfortunately, that rendered the data unusable. And that's really unfortunate, because, of course, what you want to know, and I think what the question is aimed at, is if he's not processing pain the way the rest of us do, how is he processing it? And unfortunately, for the time being, that's going to remain a mystery. But yeah, no, it's an excellent question, and I dearly wish I could give you some data to answer that.
All right, and are there individuals who do not experience reductions in pain when giving cognitive training to reduce their emotional response that you can
Yes,
impress?
absolutely.
And if so, why?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned in kind of almost one of my last slides, we do see that, and I saw it clinically as well. When I would do CBT with individuals, some people respond to it very well, others don't. We're undertaking some studies now to really get at why. So the only thing I can tell you is kind of anecdotal stuff from my clinical work, is that when I would do clinical work, there were some people who would, never open themselves to the idea, because, and completely understandably for anyone who has lived with chronic pain, all they could focus on was their pain. And so if your intervention didn't take away the pain, they weren't really that interested. And I think that there are other reasons that we can explore, one being that some people just have trouble with the cognitive behavioral intervention because they have trouble accessing their own thoughts. And so I think, perhaps for those people, another intervention like mindfulness might be good. But, it is true, we do find people who don't respond to any intervention. So I think it's really important that we begin to learn, because, why waste 8 weeks of somebody's time if, the treatment isn't going to work for them. So we really have to get at kind of how we can maximally improve those treatments.
All right, and then someone asking, what about training oneself to not need control of the pain?
Right. That, that in a way that would be more like our emotion-focused individuals. The individuals who, it doesn't, in a way, to somebody who has got good control over their emotional responses, it doesn't matter to them if they can control, or it matters less to them whether they can control it. Now, the problem is that sometimes, if, I was talking about behavioral coping strategies and emotion-focused coping strategies. The truth is that we don't really want to just rely on one. Sometimes, actually, it is better to use an active behavioral strategy to try to cope with your pain. And by analogy, I'll go back to my 2 people in traffic. One would be stupid if one would intentionally drive into a traffic jam knowing that one could control the emotional response. That's a situation where you want to use an active strategy. If you know that you can avoid a traffic jam by driving a different direction, then you are wise to do that. So, I don't want to say we should always use an emotion-focused coping strategy, because there are instances, if you knew that, say, doing physiotherapy, for half an hour every night was going to remove your pain, you would be foolish not to take up that option. So I think, the people who do best are the ones who can kind of flexibly switch between those strategies when the situation calls for it.
Very good. Let's see. Someone asking, how large a factor is nocebo, which is definitely a cognitive input of expectation or desire?
Yes, I think it's very big. And when you see, I think, when you see people expecting, people who catastrophize pain, people who expect pain to be worse, I think are very likely to be those people who get stuck in this cycle of negative emotion and pain, because we know from many studies that expecting the worst usually delivers the worst. And I think, that's one of the ways that I think depression can increase pain, is that depression is also associated with negative patterns of thinking. One of those would be about pain. So if you expect pain to be sort of ruinous and crippling, you will, it's not to say that your pain is created by that, but it certainly enhances the pain that we feel. And, when the pain is enhanced, then we get more depression and negative emotion. So I think the nocebo effect is a big part of, what maintains pain for some people. And I think what we're trying to do in a study like that last one I showed is actually reverse those type of responses.
Very good. I think that's all of the questions that I have right now. So I think we'll go ahead and end because it's almost time as well. Thank you very much, Tim, for the presentation. It was very helpful for me, so hopefully for others as well, especially for understanding brain scans, because that's a lot of what you see in research these days around chronic pain. So it's really helpful to kind of understand what that means and how to be able to wrap, quote unquote, wrap your brain around the idea of brain scans.
Yeah. Well, I hope it was helpful for people, and I'm happy to answer follow-up questions if people have them.
Wonderful. If anybody does have follow-up questions, you can email me, admin@cirpd.org, and I will pass it along to Tim.